There is increasing empirical evidence that the impact of education is not only correlated, but causally linked to major societal issues, like health, from longevity to general health status, to wealth, like economic growth and income, to happiness, to demographic changes, like fewer offsprings, to less environmental burden and increased development toward democratic systems. Taking this causal impact into account, investing into learning and creativity in the proper way becomes crucial for a society to unleash the full potential in each individual and for society as a whole. Our current educational system is developed in the 18th and 19th century and has not changed significantly since this time. Yet we now live in a world where the speed of time is remarkably different. In most disciplines, the half-time of knowledge is 5 years, and learning from courses lasting 3 to 5 years is applied to situations where in 10 years from now, 3/4 of the firms currently operating will not exist, and 40% of jobs will be replaced by automation. The question is how to improve the learning curve, unleash maximum creativity in each individual, and adapt this to the new world. What does science tell us about this question? We must bear in mind that education is always ambivalent. On the one hand, it has to conserve existing knowledge and transmit it to the next generation. On the other hand, it must prepare the present generation for the future by incorporating all the latest wisdom. Most existing educational programs do not tap into the full creative potential of our minds and brains and often lead to suboptimal outcomes. Findings in clinical psychology, neurobiology, social psychology are not sufficiently considered when setting up such programs. Education is an investment, not a consumer good. And investing in such changes generally requires about 50 years. 10 years for the actual reform and 40 years to replace the workforce under that reform. So if we want to make a change now, we have to look for different tools than the ones we have been using so far. For several decades, the world has been spending an increasing amount of money on education. However, links between input and output are relatively weak. Some examples demonstrate this. Over the last 50 years, developing countries have tripled the enrollment rate of students. Individuals there now spend more years in school than OECD countries in the 60s. However, 80% of fourth graders in India cannot read despite increasing enrollment rates in the country over the last decade. Brazil and South Korea spend about the same amount of money per capita on education, but South Korea outperforms Brazil by 176 PISA points. The US spends over $10,000 per year per capita on students aged 5 to 15, while Poland spends $3,900 on the same cohort. Both countries have similar outcomes. Finland spends the same as Spain, but Finnish students have an average 80 more PISA points than Spanish students. In OECD countries, spending has increased by a factor 2 to 3 over the last 50 years, but the results have stagnated for decades. In the US, spending has been the highest in the world over the last 50 years, yet no significant change has been seen in reading or mathematics skills over the last 40 years. In fact, they have partly grown worse. Should we actually continue along this path of more of the same? More teachers, more chalk, tablets, toilets, computers, fixed roofs, textbooks, more input. If we take the current educational progress in developing countries and project them into the future, 60 to 100 years, I repeat, 60 to 100 years would be needed to gain, for example, 100 PISA points in learning assessments. In some developing countries, it would take 100 to 300 years to catch up with the pace of learning in OECD countries. Perhaps we're doing something wrong and failing to understand the process of learning, creativity, and education in the 21st century. Doing more of the same does not make sense. We are spending more and more money and achieving less and less outcome. Input is not output. Schooling is not education, and learning is not creativity. There is two biases and false convictions that are relevant to gain a better understanding of the skewed development. First, we spend twice as much money on higher education as on primary education, and even less on preschooling, despite the fact that the educational return on investment for early educational intervention is up to 10 times higher. This is irrational, acts predominantly to feed into short-term demands of the labor market and not into the more general long-term demands of the individual and the society. Second, we do not differentiate sufficiently between the different intermediate factors that constitute the input and output factors. Roughly about a fourth can be attributed to input, such as schooling infrastructure, teaching-student ratio, pencils, textbooks, computers, and so on. 3/4 go somewhere else. They basically go into the immediate black box that lies between the input and the output of the educational system, which itself comprises of two components. The immediate black box refers to what happens between input and output, namely what occurs in the classroom. Basically, two major factors are involved, a cognitive and a non-cognitive factor. The cognitive factor refer to the curricula of the academic program in place. For primary and secondary education, this concerns skills such as literacy, calculation, verbalizing, debating, and thinking. In higher education, they represent the different degrees one can study and range from law to bioscience, from medicine to economics, from the humanities to agriculture, from arts to engineering. These cognitive factors follow a specific rationale and program in each discipline and differ from non-cognitive factors. Non-cognitive factors refer to skills we are not explicitly taught in the official curriculum. They comprise skills such as self-control, consciousness, curiosity, novelty-seeking, grit, optimism, resilience towards failure, perseverance, emotional attachment, impulse control, executive functions such as planning ahead or anticipating, stress management, self-regulation, increased working memory, focused attention, simply sitting in silence, and so on. It is the non-cognitive skills that are key to good outcomes in education and that are often overlooked. And they can be taught in two major ways. First, through personal and interpersonal properties, and second, by instituting specific lifestyle changes, which I'm going to refer as the so-called creativity response. As part of the current discussion on what determines learning in humans, John Hattie investigated 800 meta-analyses with 50,000 single studies and over 80 million students, and identified 136 variables to determine what works, what is neutral or negative, with regard to educational outcomes. Educational outcomes are mainly determined by personal and interpersonal variables, and compared with other factors such as institutional and socioeconomic ones, the personal or interpersonal variables outperform the others by a factor of 2. Whereas institutional factors have an effect size of 0.23, personal and interpersonal factors have a compound effect size of 0.49. This means that concept mapping, peer tutoring, feedback, metacognitive training, cooperative learning, self-evaluation, feedback, mutual learning, learning by teaching, among others, are doubly as effective as the institutional arrangements. Besides the interpersonal and psychological features, there is empirical evidence for at least 6 medical and psychological domains that can make a significant difference regardless of the discipline, the curriculum chosen, and the stage of education in question. I call this the six-pack, or the creativity response. It refers to several specific lifestyle modifications and attitudes which can in part be implemented in the classroom. From exercise like in-class yoga postures, to Mediterranean food and specific supplements, to good sleep habits and rest, to multisensory learning and the quality of social contacts, to mindfulness and meditation programs. This six-pack as a whole or in part has substantial impact on stress management, the learning curve, and on the creativity response in each student, regardless to the cognitive program he or she is enrolled in. And the six-packs has a robust empirical evidence from neuroscience, medicine, and clinical psychology. Human beings cannot not learn. The famous psychologist Bandura called learning a change of behavior over time. And education, according to Gary Jacobs, CEO of the World Academy of Arts and Science, defines education the most sophisticated technology evolved by human beings for conscious social evolution. This requires, besides psychologically skilled teaching staff, a lot of exercise, good quality sleep, good meals, social contacts, simply silence and meditation in the classroom, in addition to multisensory, cross-sensory learning to make all that happen. The core argument here is that we have to differentiate between input and output, cognitive and non-cognitive factors, and between psychological and lifestyle modifications. Overall, it is not the institutional input into the educational system, nor is it the cognitive input represented by the curricula or the program the student is enrolled in, but rather the non-cognitive factors that make the difference. And the six-pack described here is an easy, fast, innovative, inexpensive, and universal way of increasing the creativity in each of us.